Hello and welcome back to another part of Shopify app development with Node and React. In this video, I'm just gonna go through the steps on how to create custom session storage. And once again, this is not a tutorial. This is not an in-depth tutorial. If you want an in-depth tutorial, I have a course for that. I'll put its link in a video description below. In this video, I'm just gonna go through everything, how I create custom session storage. So if you wanna follow along, you can just follow along. And yeah, I'm not gonna explain that much in this video. Like I said, if you want an in-depth tutorial, I have a course for that. I'll put its link in the video description below because I need profit. But anyway, enough of jokes. Let's continue. Here I have my VS Code. I think the first thing that I'm going to create is another file. So I'll go here. I'll create a new folder, honestly, and I'll call this server. This is usually where I create my functions for GraphQL and for REST API. But here I'll just create a new file and I'll just call it database.js. And then honestly speaking of database, I'm going to create a new terminal and I'm going to install npm install MySQL. And because we're gonna need to access my MySQL. And also speaking of database, make sure that if you're working locally, if you wanna access MySQL, it's either you use MySQL. If you wanna install MySQL in your system, your computer, you can do that, or you can use phpMyAdmin using SAMP or WAMP. So I have my SAMP installed. I have it running right over here. So I'm using MySQL and I have in here my phpMyAdmin. So let me just open that in my browser. And I'm going to create a new database. So like I said, if you want to use other database systems like MongoDB or other MySQL database or database systems, obviously you can use that. But I'm so used using MySQL, so this is what I'm going to use. So I'm going to create a new DB and I'm going to call this Node project because my app is called Node project. Makes sense? Let's create that. And I'm going to, how many database do I need? Or how many table do I need? Or columns? Let's just call this shop. And oh yeah, so speaking of columns, I need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I need 8 because I need to save the shop URL, the session ID, the domain ID, the access token, the state, the is online and online access info, and then the scopes. So I'll just set it to 8. Or no, let's set it to 9 because there's an ID. Let's just call this, let's call it shop. It's fine. Click go. And first of all is ID, obviously. And then we can just set it to int, just set it to 255, doesn't really matter. You just set it to auto increment, make sure that it's primary key. And next up is shop underscore URL. I have a copy in here, so I know what I'm going to do. Session underscore ID. And then next up is the domain ID. If you're wondering why I'm getting the session ID and then the domain ID, because session ID and domain ID, why am I explaining? It's different. And access token. Again, if you want an explanation, I'll put the course in the video description below. And access token and then state, obviously, and then is online access info. Now let's make it lowercase, online access info. And last is the scope itself. And this one, I'll just make it varchar. How do you pronounce it, honestly? I usually pronounce it varchar because it's character, right? Car. So character. Some people pronounce it varchar, which I don't understand. But it's varchar. Correct me if I'm wrong though. So this one as well, let's all make it varchar. Doesn't really matter. Shop URL 255, 55, 255, 255, 255, 255, 255, and 255. I think that's all. Doesn't really matter. Do I need to make this unique? That's all I forgot. I think I need to make this unique because I don't want to duplicate the rows. So yeah, I'll just make this unique. I'll call it shop. Click go. And then I'll just hit save. There you go. I have my table. Let's just go back to VS Code. It's my VS Code. This one. And here, okay, so MySQL is already installed. We can finally use that. So not there. It's supposed to be in here. Constant, and then MySQL is equal to require, and then obviously MySQL. And that with semicolon. And then we're going to create a new connection. So const connection is equal to MySQL that create connect. And then here we're going to pass an object, and first is the host. And obviously this is going to be local host. And next up is the username. So user, and you can just set it to root. It depends on your system though. So since I'm using SAMP, by default it's going to be root. I think some other database system, they also use root. And for the password, and then it's supposed to be empty. And last is the database. And obviously we're going to use Node project because our database name here is called Node project. I'm so used to explaining. Anyway, let's just continue, and I'm going to use that connection, and we're going to use the connect. There we go. And I think we're good now. We can just save that and go back to our server.js. And I'm going to use that. So here, I'm going to create a new constant. You know what? Not yet, because I'm going to create a new session storage. So I'm going to create a new session storage. So instead of using the memory session storage, I'm going to create a new Shopify session.custom session storage. And here we're going to pass the store callback, the load callback, and then the delete callback. So this is going to be 3 parameters or arguments. So first is the store callback. Next is the load callback. And last is the delete callback. And we're going to create these functions in our database. So first of all, I'm going to, you know what, let's do it in here so we don't have to go back. So I'm going to create the store callback. I'm going to create the load callback and the delete callback. And then this coming from the file that we created. So require, and the file is server. Is that correct? It's supposed to be the root. So server and then database. There we go. And that with semicolon. And I think we're good now. So yeah, we can just save this and go back to the database.js, and then we're going to create that function. Okay, so let's do that. I'm going to set this to asynchronous, and then function, and then store callback. And let me just duplicate this. I'm going to do the same thing for the load callback. And last is the delete callback. And we're going to export that. So export default. Is that how I do it? No, it's module. So module that exports. And then we're going to pass here the store callback, the load callback, and then the delete, like so. All right, that's good. Save that. And for the 3 functions, we're going to pass there a set of parameters. So for the store callback, I'll use this session because if you run your Shopify store or your Shopify app, basically you'll have the following parameters, and it will contain the ID of the session. And then we're going to use the load callback So I'll pass here the session ID. So ID, and then here as well ID, because if you want to delete the callback, or basically if the Shopify app deletes the callback, or run the delete callback, it will delete the session. Yeah. Let's start with the store callback. First of all, I'm going to try out, and then pass here a catch and the error, and then we're going to throw the error. So throw new error and pass here the E. And here we're going to create a new let variable, and we'll pass the session. And finally, we can just access the online access info, and we're going to make it a JSON string. So JSON stringify, and we'll pass here the session.online access info. There you go. And we're going to check if the data.id that index off, not stringify, index off. And we're going to check the variable data.shop. We're going to check if it's greater than -1. If it is, then we'll pass the domain. Did we create a domain? I don't think so. So we're going to create a new variable here, call it let domain ID. And we'll just leave it an empty string. And here we'll just use that. So domain ID is equal to data.id, like so. Because sometimes the data ID, its value is the domain of the Shopify store. And then finally, we can do the query. So connection dot query, and we're going to start the query here. So query is insert into shop, and then the table or the columns are the shop underscore URL. Is it shop URL? Then next is the session underscore ID. Next is the domain ID. And next is the access token. And next is the state. Next is the is online. And next is the online access info. And last is the scope. There you go. And its values. Let me just this. So values. The values are, wait a second. So data shop, data ID, domain ID, data access token. Okay, so the values are, let's just create in here a set of single quotes. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And first of all is the data ID. So shop. Data.shop because shop URL, not ID. We don't need to set the ID because it's already auto increment. Okay, next up is the session ID. So obviously we're going to access the shop and we're going to access the ID. And for the domain ID, we'll also do the same thing. Instead of shop ID, we'll access the domain ID. Like so. So what happens here actually is if the ID of the session contains a value of Shopify URL, then that means the ID is not the session ID, rather than it's a domain ID. So we'll just pass that there. And next up is the access token. So data.access token. Is that it? Yeah. And next up is the state. State is online. So here we'll just do the same thing. Pass the data and then the state. Next up is the is online. So data.isOnline. And then here supposed to be data.online access info. Make sure they close that. And last is the scope. So data.scope. I think we're good now. or at least that's what I know. Okay, so we also need to use the duplicate key update because we are using the unique key. So after this, we're going to use the on duplicate key. If it's duplicate, then what we're going to do is to update the access token. So update access token, and we'll just pass here the data access token. So data.access token. What else? So we're updating the access token. We also need to update the state, the session ID, domain ID, the scope, and then the online access info. At least that's what I'm doing here in my script. So online, duplicate key update access token, and we also need to update the state. Wait a second. Just go back. So here, state, and next is the session ID. So session underscore ID, and next is the domain ID, and next is the scope, and last is the online access info. Online access info, and last, is that the last? Yeah, I think that's the last one. Okay, so let's just add values here. So for the state, we'll just do the same thing. Access the data dot state. Is that right? Yeah. And for the session ID, obviously, we're going to use the data ID. So data.id. And for the domain ID, obviously, we'll do the same thing. Data, domain ID. And for the scope, we'll use the data.scope. And for the online access info, wait a second. For the online access info, we'll use the data.online access info. Okay. Just end that with semicolon. I think we're good now with our query. The next thing we're going to do is just to give it a callback function. So I forgot about that. So after this quote, or at least the end of the query, we're going to add a function. So going to add a function, and then here we need the error. We also need the results. We also need the fields. Function. And inside of this, we're going to check if there's an error. If there's an error, then obviously we're going to throw an error. Okay, I think that's good. After this query, we'll just return true because this is a promise. So true. Okay. What else do we need? Okay, I guess we can continue now with the load callback. Inside of this, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to create a try. And we're gonna need a catch. Supposed to be error. And then we're going to create a throw new error. I'll pass the error. And inside of the try, we'll access the we're going to create a new session. Let session and then new session. And we're going to create that session. I think we need to access that. So above this, we're going to create a new session or session, and we'll access that using the require, and then it should be from the Shopify. So at Shopify API, supposed to be Shopify API, and then dist, and then auth, and then session. Okay, then we can finally use that. So here, session, new session, and pass here the ID. and with semicolon, and then we can finally, where's that? We're going to create a new query. Okay, let query, and then new promise. And then first is we're going to create here the resolve and then the reject. And then underneath of this, we're doing the resolve. And after that, we're going to create a new query. So connection.query. So we're going to select select everything from the shop table, where session ID is equal to, okay, single quotes, data.id or session.id. So session, wait a second. Oh yeah, ID. We'll access the ID. Or the domain ID is equal to the ID. So it could be the domain ID or session ID. Domain or no, just ID. So, and we just want one. So limit 1. And after that, we'll do the same thing. We'll create a callback. We just end up with semicolon. It's supposed to be function. And then we need the error. We need the results. We also need the fields. And then we're going to check if there's an error first. If there's an error, then don't continue. Throw the error. Otherwise, if there are no errors, then we'll start creating the session. So session.shop is equal to results. And then the key is 0. And then shop underscore URL. And then we could just duplicate this because we need to set up the session. Next state. Next is the scope. And access the scope. And next is the is online. And access the is online. And next is the online access info. Online access info. And last is the access token. But first of all, we have to make sure that isOnline is a Boolean value, not a string value. Because from our database, going to be a string value. So what we're going to do is to check if its value is true. If it is, then pass the value, or if it is, then pass a Boolean value of true, otherwise false. I think we're good now. We can just continue and create the date. So here, we're going to create a new date, and it's supposed to be new date. And we'll set its value. So date dot set date, and date dot get date, and we'll just add 1. And then we're going to pass that date to our expire. So expires and just date. Okay. And also we're going to check if the session that expires and type of session that expires is equal to string. If it is a string, and if the session expires set, then what we're going to do is to pass a value for our session expires, and let's just create a new date and session dot expire. There you go. And I think we're good now. Supposed to be inside of the if, or inside of the function, because as soon as we create the query, we should resolve it. Okay, I think we're good now. So the last thing we're going to do is just to await. So underneath of this, we're going to await the query. And then use the return and then session. Okay. Last is the delete callback. So inside of this, we'll just do the same thing, try, and then use the catch, press an E, and then use the throw error, throw new error, and then error, E. And then inside of this, it doesn't really matter, you can just return false. There you go. If you want to delete a session from your database, this is where you're gonna do it. Otherwise, just return false. Okay, so save that. I think we're good now. So we can just continue and try our Shopify app. Okay, so we have our functions now. Store callback, load callback, and delete callback from our database. So what we're going to do is just to restart our Shopify app. So Y and then TLS and then npm run dev. Okay, let's go back to our Shopify app. I'll just refresh this. And it should redirect me to the apps page. Or not. All right, so internal server error. Let me just honestly uninstall the Shopify app. Let's install this or delete. And let me just open my app. And let's open our database. It's still empty. Okay, so select store. I'm going to select my example development store. Custom session stored failed to store a session. Our details, reference error, shop is not defined. Shop is not defined. Okay, so I think I found out the error. I think it's just my condition here. So if data I'm supposed to be outside of the function, not here. So index off, and then we're going to compare that if it's greater than -1. And also here in my query, I think I have a problem here. Data.shop. There it is. Shop. Data. Okay, finally got it. Let me just double check. May I have here another shop. Okay, everything looks good. Save it, and then let's try it again. So npm run dev. Okay, let's try it again. Select store. Let's just open that in a new tab. And example development store. There we go. Finally. There we go. Finally. Now it's authenticating, and now we can finally install it. And if we go back to VS Code, I believe we don't have console.log for the session. But if we open our database, we should have the following rows. So ID, example, development store, you have the session ID and it's still empty, and the access token is undefined. And that's because we haven't installed the app yet. So if we go back here and install the app, it should do the load callback, and then it's going to update the session. And in that session, should have the access token. So if we, as you can see, now we're back to apps page. But if we go back to our database and refresh it, as you can see, now we have the session ID, now we have the domain ID, we also have the access token, and so on. So there we go. That's how I usually create session storage. But yeah, if you want to learn more, I'll put the course in the video description below. And as always, yeah, I'll pretty much create another part for this. I guess this series now. I'll create another video how to create REST API calls or GraphQL. Yeah, probably in the future videos. So yeah, If you enjoyed this video, let me know by hitting the like button and subscribe and hit that notification bell button so you won't miss my future uploads. And again, guys, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Enjoy coding.